welcome to you. We are glad you're here. We hope to make this hour worth your while. This is called Emerging Issues in Academic Advising Theory, a panel discussion. You see the smiling faces of the panel before you. And let me just briefly tell you who they are, even though I think you can see their names on your screen. To that side, no, that side, is Mark Lowenstein of the Richard Stockton College of New Jersey. I'm also from the Richard Stockton College of New Jersey. I'm getting left and right mixed up here, so I'm not even going to try. I see Janet Schulenberg next to me. She's from Penn State University. Next to her is Hillary Himes, also from Penn State University. And Sarah Champlin-Scharf up at Harvard University, still trying to orient herself as to left and right. Welcome all of the panelists. We collectively, I think it's fair to say we have done a lot of writing and presenting in the area of academic advising theory and philosophy. We don't always agree with each other, but for this next hour we have promised to behave. And since we're in 3 different states, fisticuffs are unlikely. At any rate, we're here to talk about the importance of theory and philosophy. These are indeed important questions that we need to concern ourselves with. At this point in the history of academic advising as a field, I think it's fair to say that we're at a sort of a crossroads, very much parallel to the self-authorship body of theory that we've heard so much about in recent years. That crossroads is a place where we're probably at the point of deciding what to do as a field. Up until now, we've used the theory, the philosophy of other fields to get us started, and we're very grateful for that. But we may wish to start making some decisions on our own and go off on our own and generate our own theory, our own philosophy from the field itself. We could call it a crossroads, or we could call it a confluence. We could think of the theory and philosophy of academic advising as a river that has had some major tributaries feed into it over the past 40 or 50 years. One might be called informational. Prescriptive advising is what it's commonly known as. And that theory or that approach to advising has not gone away. Many people still do it. And some, I would think, would salute to that as their theory of academic advising. Developmental advising, for many years, held sway as the preeminent theory or body of theory in our field, and that's still with us, very much so. More recently, since about 2006, what we could only call educational theories of academic advising have joined that river. That's a major tributary. That shows up on the bumper sticker that should be on your cars that says advising is teaching. And that is the idea that NACADA has gotten behind in the last several years, the advising is teaching model. And more recently still, many approaches that we might call relational, having to do with things like appreciative advising and hermeneutics, some of which we'll hear about in the coming hour. For all of these, your thoughts, your comments, your questions are very welcome. We'll try to get to them during the course of the hour if time permits, but certainly afterwards if we can't fit them all in. So one of the things that I think that everybody on the panel agrees with is that theory is very much related to practice, and that we really cannot practice academic advising without some sort of theory behind it. It may be an unconsidered theory, not well thought out, but a theory nevertheless. And it might be something rather simple, where an advisor would say, well, to the student, just print out the degree evaluation, come in and see me, and we'll tell you what courses to take. More or less a prescriptive approach. That advisor, though we may not want to have that person on our staffs, still has a theory of advising, which says something along the lines of, well, advising is just telling them what course to take next. A developmental advisor, one who approaches things with that model or theory in mind, is going to be worrying about the various developmental stages that the students should be going through and foster that process. For those who ascribe more to advising as teaching as their approach, they might be thinking in terms of learning outcomes and pedagogy, and how to foster those, how to determine what a learning outcome is. At least 2 of the people on the panel here have written about hermeneutic advising. That's an approach borrowed from the humanities. And if you approach advising in that way, you're more likely to think of things like, well, how do I interact with this text, so to speak, before me? Such advisors know that interpretation and meaning are central to the practice of advising. So we've all got at least a rudimentary theory of advising, or else we wouldn't be doing it. So let's examine some really important questions in our field. And the next one coming up on the screen, which I'm going to ask Hillary to address, is what is the relationship between theory and philosophy?
Thanks, Peter. So the distinction between theory and philosophy is a point of confusion, and it's not one that everyone on this panel agrees with. But it's important to clarify at the beginning of our conversation today how we're using these terms, at least for the purpose of this webinar today. So we are drawing a distinction between theory and philosophy. So in this webinar, we will use philosophy as it relates to some of the big ideas and values that inform how one views the world. One of the definitions of philosophy, and like many things, there are many definitions, but one is the critical study of the basic principles and concepts of a particular branch of knowledge, especially with a view to improving or reconstituting them. So we hear things like philosophy of science, philosophy of education, philosophy of history. A philosophy of advising, then, would examine the foundational concepts regarding what academic advising is and why it is important. So the answers to those two questions, the what is and why, will dictate particular theories that are useful in translating our philosophy to practice. A theory is a set of statement or set of statements that provides authority for making generalizations and explanations about events. So a theory then would drive the selection of particular approaches and would help make sense of information that we gain through those approaches. Building on some of Peter's examples, if an academic advisor viewed the philosophy of academic advising as helping students satisfy requirements and build self-esteem, they may select theories from social psychology to inform their practice. In another example, if an advisor sees the philosophy of advising as teaching students about the curriculum and broader life skills, then advisors may choose theories that focus on how individuals might construct knowledge, using theories such as constructivism to inform and develop their approaches. Theory and philosophy are not personal opinions or hypotheses. Everyone has a philosophy of advising, even if they haven't given intentional reflection on that philosophy. A personal philosophy of advising is different from a shared philosophy, although they should be closely aligned.
Thank you, Hillary. Janet, we're going to turn to you for the next question, which you've done considerable amount of work on. Where do the theory and philosophy of advising stand today, in your opinion?
All right, thanks, Peter. Where we stand today, I think, is a result of our history. So in order to understand where we are, we really need to know why things happened as they did. The way academic advising developed as an important facet of higher education has influenced our current thinking about advising. And as you described in your opening statement, Peter, some of those parts of that history have been more influential than others, have been feeding into that river more strongly than others. And those are the ones I want to focus on today. The origins of American academic advising came with the origin of curricular choice in American higher education. So, for example, at Harvard and Johns Hopkins, the idea for expanding curricular choice was that students should have the ability to construct their own educations, and because learning to learn was what was important to the faculty. This quote on the screen from Harvard illustrates that intention. Allowing students academic choice forces the student to become conscious of what he is doing, permits him to become a partaker in his own work, and makes him perceive that gains and losses are immediately connected with a volitional attitude. When such a consciousness is aroused, every step in knowledge becomes a step towards maturity. So in these systems, faculty were really concerned that students make decisions about how to construct their educations thoughtfully, and so they set up academic advising as a way to partner with students as they crafted their educations. And that first concept of advising really was an ideal definition or a guiding philosophical perspective. It doesn't seem to describe what actually happened in practice, but it's defined what advising was supposed to be and accomplish. Through the early to mid-20th century, as more and more students went to college and as the diversity of their previous experiences increased, college personnel began to develop philosophies and theories about the role of colleges, particularly in developing students along psychosocial dimensions. Beginning in the 1920s, the student personnel point of view was developed by those who worked in areas that would today be associated with student affairs divisions. The student personnel point of view regarded higher education as the place to help students meet the goals listed on the slides. For example, to help students adjust to the college environment, develop a better sense of self, make progress toward volitional goals, develop healthy habits, and other things. Many of the people who developed these goals for the outcome of student interaction came from academic backgrounds in psychology. So you see that developmental perspective coming through. Throughout this time and continuing today, academic advisors came primarily from faculty roles and performed the advising role on top of their other responsibilities. Not all were aware of or subscribed to this perspective on the role of higher education and student development. As the roles of faculty changed and as college curricula changed, some colleges began designating others to play primary roles as academic advisors, and those individuals often came from backgrounds in psychology as well. And this became increasingly common beginning in the 1960s and 1970s. In the early 1970s, several key things happened that solidified academic advising as a distinct role in higher education, and which aligned that role very distinctly with the student personnel point of view. One of those is two publications, Crookston's publication of the Developmental Advising as Teaching article and O'Banion's publication of an Academic Advising Model. Both of those publications are cited as key moments in advising's history, where both authors called for recognition of students as multidimensional individuals who need to engage in a developmental relationship through academic advising. At the same time, NACADA's influential individuals in the early years of NACADA also championed that view. The developmental or student personnel point of view, the point of view that advising fosters student development, became a guiding philosophy that influenced the field scholarship and practice. So advising practitioners were able to rally around this concept wherever they were and whatever their positions happened to be in the institution. You can see why it was so powerful. This eventually, however, led to a bit of a language problem, which I think we're still trying to sort out today. And I think that term developmental has three different meanings in advising, and they have not always been made distinct from each other. So I'd like to mention that, and that's what's on the slide here. I think developmental advising refers to advising influenced by the student personnel point of view, which posits that academic advising is an activity that's meant to promote holistic student development. I think that's different from developmental theory, which may refer to a variety of psychosocial theories that explain and predict how humans develop their personalities, their identities, their habits of decision-making, their meaning-making, etc. And that's different, too, from developmental approaches, which are those techniques that advisors might use to promote a particular kind of psychosocial development in their students. Anyway, this philosophy, this developmental philosophy, guided what has been commonly accepted as legitimate theory, which has in turn guided what are accepted approaches in academic advising practice. They point us toward what we think advising accomplishes and why we accomplish it and how to accomplish those things. Well, that student personnel point of view allowed practitioners to draw a distinction between their roles as academic advisors from those who advise from other primary roles in the university. It muddled the role of academic advising with other student affairs areas, with counseling, and with other parts of higher education that are all also valuable. Some authors challenged that developmental philosophy. So our own Mark Lowenstein, Marty Hemwall, Kent Trachty, those authors in their publications advocated for a focus of advising on student learning about their academic decisions. And around that same time, a NACADA task force was named to provide a definition of academic advising, no easy task. And that resulted in not a definition, but in NACADA's concept of academic advising statement. And that statement is important because it very clearly, as Peter mentioned in his Advising is Teaching bumper sticker, it clearly aligned academic advising with student learning, allowing advising to lay claim to a distinct segment of higher education and concisely describe the role of academic advising as a teaching endeavor. So that brings us to the conversation we're having today. That conversation continues about what academic advising is meant to accomplish within the university, the expertise that's needed to fill that role, and the range of theories that should guide advising practice. So to me, there are two really important movements happening in advising theory stemming from this expansion of talk from development into teaching. First, there's a movement towards diversification of the theories from other fields that are being applied to academic advising, and especially important is a diversification into theories that were developed in fields aligned with the humanities. So hermeneutic theory, queer theory, other theories like that are contributing substantially to our understanding of how advising impacts students. Second, there's an active discussion of academic advising's distinctiveness in higher education, and I think that conversation will become increasingly important in the next couple of years. Both of these movements in advising theory are happening at the same time and are important in helping the field move into its maturity.
Very good. We're going to move over to Hillary in just a moment, but I wanted to point out that many of the articles that Janet was just referring to can be found in the, not in their entirety, but bibliographic information can be found in the handout for the articles that Janet was referring to. And Janet, it sounds like there's some, at one point, unexpected tributaries to this river that we've been talking about, maybe some hidden well springs that we can't even see very readily.
Maybe.
So, but now Hillary has been thinking, writing, and researching on these kinds of questions quite recently. So, Hillary, we are going to turn to you for your thoughts on this important question. What theories of advising, in your view, are represented in the most important literature on the subject out there today? Okay,
yes,
I
thanks,
modified
Peter.
the question, but go ahead.
So I'll frame my answer actually around the two movements that Janet just mentioned, the expansion and the breadth of theories applied to advising, but also talking about advising's distinctiveness. So as Janet mentioned, the breadth of theories applied to academic advising has greatly expanded. I think this is really a testament to the range of backgrounds and experiences that academic advisors bring to this field. But it also demonstrates the interdisciplinary nature of advising. So advising demands that academic advisors understand something about students, about education, and even communication. Theories represented in the literature reflect those knowledge areas. I will review some of these theories very, very briefly, but there are also more in-depth resources available in your handout. So take a look at those if you're interested. I also will describe how examining these theories may help provide a starting point for developing theory that fits this distinctive nature of advising within higher ed, and perhaps even help inform a philosophy of academic advising. So many disciplines, primarily the social sciences, education, and humanities, for today's webinar, have provided theories found in current advising literature. I've grouped these theories by broad discipline, but understand that there are overlaps in each of these and among their ideas within theories. So let me just talk a bit about what each of these disciplines will bring to theory and advising. The social sciences, psychology and sociology among others, provide theories that help us to understand students as individuals and how students interact with their social environment. Theories based in these fields include developmental theory, as Janet mentioned, self-authorship theory, which Peter has already mentioned, as well as theories that focus on identity development. Again, as Janet mentioned, the NACADA concept of academic advising emphasizes that advising is connected to the educational mission of colleges and universities. With this goal in mind, theories that are based in education provide a foundation for advisors to understand the learning process, determine appropriate teaching strategies, and understanding the individual as a learner. Educational theory does draw heavily on other disciplines, but has a focus on teaching and learning. Some theories from education include constructivism, social constructivism, and even curriculum theory. Most recently, as you've heard little tidbits throughout this webinar so far, theories from the humanities have contributed important ideas to advising. Understanding the complex process of interpretation and interaction is important when talking to students. And so some of the theories from the humanities include hermeneutic theory and postmodernism. This diversification of theory applied to academic advising is certainly a positive for the field. The frequency of these theories in advising scholarship suggests that they provide depth, support, and context, and may even suggest that advisors are looking for theory that informs particular aspects of advising. By examining these theories, I've found some common characteristics, which I think indicate that these things are important to advisors. By considering why these theories were chosen may provide a new way of looking and developing theory specifically for advising. Or in other words, developing a set of statements that can help explain and understand advising experiences. Overlapping characteristics of these commonly discussed theories can help clarify areas that are important to academic advising. And so I've identified three broad categories. The first is the development of skills. In many of these theories that I mentioned, teaching students to develop critical thinking skills and decision-making skills are common. Number two is the focus on education, so understanding the process of learning and pedagogy. This is evident in a lot of John Dewey's work and constructivism, but it's also important in self-authorship and developmental theory. And finally, category three, interpretation and communication, focusing really on the role of narrative and meaning-making. Self-authorship focuses on how individuals make meaning. Postmodern theory identifies the role of small personal truths, and hermeneutics focuses on the act of interpretation, which we'll hear more about in a minute. So you can see these theories don't necessarily fall along the discipline lines, but actually have components of these different categories across disciplines. So these essential components, I think, can provide the foundation for developing theory that is specifically tailored to academic advising, instead of continuing to borrow theories that are well suited for other disciplines.
Thank you, Hillary. Now, Sarah, Hillary has made a rather bold assertion, among other things. Thank you for all of them, but she has asserted that interpretation and communication are very important to the process of advising. Now, in days gone by, it wasn't so important because, you know, students were just there to do what we told them to do, and we didn't have to worry about communicating. Ew. But times have changed, perhaps, and we've broadened our conception of how advising should be thought of. So, may we turn to you and have you talk to us about how this really plays out. We know that our understanding of any other human being is limited, so with those limitations of interpretation and communication, how should that limited ability to know our students affect how we think about the nature of advising?
That is a good question. First, let me say my lights have turned off in my office, so I'm going to turn them on. I don't know whether it matters or not, but so I'm not flying.
Sarah?
Sarah, this is Lee. We lost you when you did their little flying, so let's check your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. At my attempt to turn on the light. So what I was starting to say is that I think it's uncontroversial to say that as human beings, our ability to know is finite. That is, we don't have some sort of direct line to the absolute truths of the universe. And in a similar sort of way, we don't have a direct line to the absolute truths of our advisees. So, you know, we don't intuitively understand who they are and what's important to them. Although it seems important for us to at least know to some extent who they are and understand them if we want to give them good advice and help them construct a meaningful education. It seems good advising should involve the co-construction of an education that is, an education that involves students and one that helps them figure out what's important to them and what they want, and that's, it's our job to help them do that. Of course, we need to get them to graduate. We have to help them fulfill all the requirements they need to and get them through that process. But it also seems important to help them figure out and create an education that has significance in their life. And as such, it's important that together we figure out the kind of education that's important to each of them. And of course, the question then is...
Sarah, this is Gary.
Yes?
Sarah? This is Gary. Since you reconnected, your volume is really low, and we're getting feedback from participants that they can't hear you either. Probably what we should do is have you close out and come back in. Peter, I don't know if you want to adjust the question ahead while she does that and then come back to this. That's your call. But reconnecting after you were in the room, Sarah, it has not restored the volume levels like we had before.
Okay.
We can barely hear you.
I'll close out and come back in.
Okay. Sorry for that curve, Peter.
Thank you for the suggestion, Gary, but I think that's okay. I think the way that this should unfold is we should wait for her to come back. To the 74 colleges out and universities out there, stand by. This process does not take long, I can assure you. Sarah seems to be back with us. Should we just do a mic check?
Yep, can you hear me now? Yes? Okay.
We can.
So apologies for those who couldn't hear me. I think to sum up sort of what I said was that as human beings we have a finite ability to understand things, and it's also the case with our advisees, and we don't intuitively understand them, and so it's important that we try and figure out a way to understand them. So it's important that we do this together with students, that we help to usher them through, and that we co-create an education. So in order to do that, I think interpretation becomes central to the process of academic advising, and it's where the field of hermeneutics, I think, can be invaluable. Simply stated, hermeneutics is the art of interpretation. It's the kind of inquiry that is focused on figuring something out when it's difficult to understand. It can help provide a foundation for our work and gives us tools to help make sense of the students we advise. So let me give you the sort of nickel tour of what hermeneutic understanding involves. So again, to start with, a hermeneutic understanding begins with the notion that something needs to be uncovered. There's something we have to figure out. We don't quite get it. It's complicated. And so in our case, it's the advisee that we need to figure out. Hermeneutic theory focuses our attention on context. Some theorists would call it social historical context. Other hermeneutic theorists might not agree with that, but I think it's helpful for us to think of it that way. The idea is that meaning isn't something objectively contained out there in the world, but it's instead something that involves how we interpret things, and the context of our own lived experience creates what's meaningful. So, for example, a class wouldn't be good or bad in and of itself, but it would depend on whether that class has the right meaning for that particular student. It's not to say, obviously, that there aren't objective things about a class that would make it good or bad. If you have a class where none of the students all show up and none of them have done any of their work, or the instructor happens to not know the material, it's not going to be a good class. But whether the class fulfills a requirement for graduation, or whether it's seminar style or lecture style, or whether it provides a needed skill for a student for their career, or a number of other things, those are the sorts of things that would make the course good or bad for an individual student. So central to this sort of interpretation is the social historical place from within which we're situated. In order to figure out how things make sense for our advisees, from this perspective, an advisor needs to understand where the student's coming from, so to speak. And from the hermeneutic perspective, this ought to include the influences of his or her existence with others, whether that's family or friends, groups, and it could be disaffiliations or affiliations. It also includes the influence of where he or she exists contextually in the world. This doesn't mean the physical universe, but it includes things like race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, but also place of birth, educational background, number of siblings, all those sorts of things. And it also involves time, that is, how things are altered and developed over the course of time. Hermeneutic theory then involves the notion that meaning is determined by the particular significance something has for an individual human being and not something simply contained objectively out there in the world. And with this kind of knowledge, advisors can begin the process of identifying those continually changing existential circumstances that influence understanding and are what define how something has meaning for an individual student. We recognize then that who an advisee is should involve recurrent discovery of how and from where he or she interprets the world. So of course the question then is, well, that's great that that's how students find, how all of us find meaning and how things make sense of us, but how do we uncover that? How do we figure out what those things are? And I think as advisors, it's probably the easier question to answer, and that's through conversation and dialogue, things that we sort of do anyway. That's, how we communicate. It's, I feel like I should recognize, however, that there are obviously those particular students that don't want to talk to us or maybe are really shy. There are some ways that we have difficulties, but, we find ways around that. But advising undoubtedly involves the notion of, involves the process of conversation and dialogue, and it can be central to the process of understanding and interpretation then for us. The question is how we ought to approach conversation and dialogue itself. How do we do it? There are obviously lots of ways to communicate, and I'd like to take a cue from Socratic dialogues, the ones that Plato describes, and notice that unlike regular conversation, Socratic dialogue is focused on acquiring knowledge and understanding. So in this way, the purpose of dialogue isn't simply to convey information back and forth from one person to another, but it instead is to try and identify and uncover the underlying reality or meaning or truth about whatever's being discussed. And even further, each of the dialogues, Socrates confesses his ignorance and starts from a place of openness and attempts to avoid making beliefs and assumptions about whatever he has, whatever understanding he has is correct. So signaled here is the idea that understanding ought to involve the lifelong search with an eye towards the limits of what can be known. And knowledge in this way ought to involve a continual process of understanding with a recognition that we never quite get it right, that we'll never quite identify the absolute truths of our students in this case, or our advisees. So through dialogue, we can begin the process that will help us understand our advisees, a process that ought to begin with recognition of what we don't know about our advisees and an awareness of the limitations of what we can know, generally speaking. And we can use this sort of Socratic ignorance to remain open to what our advisees have to say, who they are, how they make sense of things. So if we think about this in terms of an advising conversation, you can think of at least a couple of ways to approach an advising conversation. For example, one about course selection. So one approach is focused on helping the students pick whatever required courses they have, making sure that they are courses that they would be prepared for, and that they that they would get them to graduation in the time that they need, they need to be done. They always want to take the classes that they aren't really, prepared for. So that's great, and that, gets the students to pick their courses, and it, hopefully makes sure that they're on the right track for graduation. But it's not telling us anything about the student. It's not helping us figure out who they are. So if we think about adding this hermeneutic component to it, then when you're having the conversation, you can talk about courses that they've chosen in the past and why they've chosen those courses, or courses that they think they might be interested in. It could bring up the question of, if they want to take a introductory life science course, maybe they want to take it because they're interested in becoming a doctor. They want to go to medical school. That's great. Then that brings that up to the surface, and you can start talking about whether that really is something that they want. Do they really understand what's involved in being a doctor? Not everybody's wealthy that's a doctor. So, the first approach gets the job done and gets us to graduation, hopefully. But the second one helps us craft an education for the student. It helps us figure out what will be meaningful and useful for them. To me, truly meaningful advice that matters to the individual student ought to be grounded in an understanding that's nuanced and involves a self-consciousness of our own context and limitations, our advisees' context and limitations, and a continual reassessment of all of those things.
All right. Sarah, thank you very much. We've had a number of really good questions come up, and I'd like to look at two of those questions now, if we might. We're doing just fine on time, and I promised Mark he will have plenty of time to speak, so we're good. One question comes from Terry Musser at Penn State University, and that question is, I don't know if all 75 of you participants can see all of the questions, but she asks, how is this, and by this she means hermeneutics, how is this different from social constructivism? And I'd like to turn to Hillary for an answer to that. We do have to keep it brief, though, if you can.
I'll try my best. So not being an expert in either of those theories, but having read a little bit about each, I would say that there are certainly similarities in some of the considerations. Social constructivism is geared a little bit more toward the psychosocial development of a particular individual, and hermeneutics is geared more toward interpretations, which also includes particular academic advisors' perspectives and experiences as well. So that would probably be the biggest difference, but there are certainly similarities as well.
Thank you, Hillary.
Thanks for the question, Terry.
Yes. Another question comes from Leon Gardner. Leon, I'm not sure what institution you're from, but Leon's question is, do these theories have any impact on the development of an advising syllabus? Now, it's a complex question because it presupposes that one should have an advising syllabus, which is something I think many of us agree with. But what would you say? This is open to any of the panelists, so raise your hand if you'd like to take a shot at that. And if nobody raises their hand, was that a hand, Mark? No.
It's a hand. Yes, it is.
Go for it.
Okay, thanks. I think it is a good question. I would say that I think it's pretty clearly true that the notion of an advising syllabus grew out of discussion of advising from a learning-centered point of view, and from the idea that advising either is teaching or is like teaching or is a kind of teaching, one or the other or another of those. I don't want to choose among them, but that advising as teaching is where the notion came from. And so there are some philosophies of advising, and I'll be talking about philosophies of advising in a minute. and some theories related to advising that would lead you to be interested in a question of an advising syllabus where others probably wouldn't. If you see advising as being something like what professors do, well, professors have syllabi, so you probably will want to also. And I think, in fact, that advising syllabi have been tremendously successful and effective, and that's one of the best things about learning-centered models of advising, is that it led to that.
Very good. Thank you, Mark. Leon informs us he's from the College of Coastal Georgia. Leon, how's the weather down there? But meanwhile, we're going to ask Mark to wrestle with the next question, which is a very important question in this field and pretty much for any field. But in our field, it goes like this. What will a successful philosophy of advising accomplish?
Thank you, Peter. First, I need to explain what I mean by a philosophy of advising. We're trying very hard to be careful with our terminology in this webinar and to avoid being confusing, and that means we have to sometimes stop for definitions. A philosophy of advising is, the way I'm going to be talking about it, a statement of the essential nature and purpose of advising. A statement of the essential nature and purpose of advising. The first important point that follows from this definition is that a philosophy of advising is a normative statement, what advising ideally could and should be, not necessarily what it is in all cases, or maybe even in any cases. It's what it should be. Because it's a should statement and not an is statement, a philosophy of advising isn't testable the way social science theories are. It doesn't claim to describe or analyze what advisors actually do, so it's not really even trying to be accurate in any sense. Instead, it poses an ideal for advisors to strive for, to live up to. Next, the philosophy of advising that I think we're looking for will also be a comprehensive philosophy in the sense that it's about any advising in any setting for any students. That may seem strange to some of our listeners because our settings differ so much, but I'll try to explain. How we advise, the approaches we take, the methods we take, may vary a lot depending on who our students are, what kind of institution we're at, what kind of majors we're advising. But I'm looking for a philosophy of why we advise, not how we advise. And I believe that such a philosophy could cover all those bases. This philosophy will say what elements of all of those different types of advising, varieties of advising, should and could have in common in terms of their essential purpose. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy, quite the contrary. It's much easier said than done, as so many things are. Now, we can each have our own philosophy of advising. Now I forget which of my colleagues said that we all do. I think Hillary said that. We all have one. And I'm sure that most of us do. And if you can have a philosophy that you've never actually expressed in words, then I guess everyone does. But I think that there needs to be discussion and debate within the profession aimed toward a philosophy that we can all unite around. Why? Well, for one reason, if I share my ideas with you and you share your ideas with me, we're both forced to state our philosophies clearly and precisely, which is something that I suspect a lot of us haven't had any need to do before. Next, we'll both have the opportunity to see things that we've missed in our own philosophies and learn from each other, and improve our thinking. We might help each other discover assumptions that we've been making that we weren't aware of, or ways that our philosophy isn't clear. For another reason, a philosophy that we all agreed on would provide unity of purpose for all of us in the field. I think that that would be desirable. Moreover, and maybe even more important, a philosophy that we all agree on could articulate for our stakeholders why advising is essential. And I think some of our stakeholders don't really know that. The stakeholders I'm talking about include deans, provosts, presidents, trustees, state legislators, newspapers, and maybe most important of all, students. Because I think, and I'm sure most of you will agree, that students don't always have a good idea of what it is they ought to be expecting from us. Now, even if we can't all agree easily on a philosophy, I think a period of debate regarding competing philosophies would be great for our profession, providing each of us with an opportunity to participate in contemplation about what we're trying to accomplish and why. And that may actually be the most important reason of all, even if we don't get the agreement I'd like to see. Now, next stage in my discussion. Here are the goals or criteria that I was set for a successful philosophy of advising. This is in fact what will mark it as successful. First, it should be tied to a philosophy of higher education. Before we can say what advising is about, I think we ought to have an idea of what education is about. Because if the two aren't linked, I don't think we'll be able to show that advising is essential to education. Next, our philosophy needs to identify common elements of all of the disparate activities, settings, populations that go under the heading of advising. Moreover, it should distinguish, this is a technical concept, it should distinguish essential from incidental characteristics of advising in the Aristotelian sense. Sorry for bringing in Greek philosophers, but that's obligatory for me. The essential characteristics, seriously now, the essential characteristics are what make advising advising. The ones that, if they're not present, it's just not advising. Whereas incidental characteristics may be present often, they may be present always, but they are not the things that make advising advising. I think, for example, signing off on course registrations, which is still done at plenty of institutions, I don't think that's what makes advising advising, even if at your school you have to do it. Moreover, now moving on to an equally important point, based on those same essential characteristics, our philosophy should distinguish advising from other activities that advising may be confused with sometimes. For example, how is advising different from counseling? Counseling is like advising in some ways, but different in others. And I think Janet mentioned earlier that the developmental philosophy of advising has been accused by some of us, including me, of not having a good answer to that question. How are those two things different? Next, our philosophy should identify what advisors do for those inside and for those outside the advising community, and should show why advising is critical to achieving the goals that our institutions set for their students. That's one of the reasons why I think a philosophy that we all agreed on would really be beneficial, because it would be tremendously important for, quite frankly, political purposes for advisors. Next, our philosophy should imply, and it will, a standard for what students and other stakeholders can expect from advisors, so that those expectations are appropriate, and so we can be judged according to our own goals and standards that we've set, not on goals and standards that have been set by others who have different agendas. And finally, our philosophy should inspire advisors to reach for a vision of excellence, an ideal to live up to. And I think maybe I don't need to say more about that one. It should just put a brass ring out there for us all to grab at. And those are the criteria by which I think we could evaluate a comprehensive philosophy. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Mark. Well, panelists, we've got about 10 minutes left. And to the audience out there across our two nations, hello once again. And we're prepared to look at this question. But we have a question that's come in from Suzanne Tapp. Suzanne, thank you for your question. I think this really should go now, coming as it does on the heels of Mark's assertions. Suzanne asks, do other professions or fields center themselves around just one philosophy? Is that realistic given the diversity of institutions, students, and missions, etc.? Mark, you're sort of the ideal person to respond to that, but any of the other panelists may do so as well.
Well, maybe I should be required to take a shot at this, and I'm never bashful. I think, Suzanne, I think that's a tremendous question, and I think that most of them at least aspire to. I would say, for example, suppose, and I'm not a specialist in this area, but I might say, okay, in medicine is about promoting and protecting human health. That's very simple, it's very short, it's a bumper sticker, but, and I don't know, I doubt that there are exceptions, but it might seem to bring together all of the diversity of institutions, patients, and missions involved that medicine treats. It was a stab, I'm sure it could be clarified, and probably if there are any physicians listening, they could improve on it. But the fact that hospitals differ and that different medical specialties differ doesn't necessarily prevent there from being a single philosophy of what medicine's about, even if the one I stated isn't any good.
Very good. Others on the panel, do you wish to respond? Very good. And thank you, Suzanne, for that excellent question. All right, then I think we'd like to spend the remaining 5 to 7 minutes on answering the question that's on the screen now. Where is the theory of advising headed? If we want to use the metaphor of the river, where is it headed? Where would you like to see it head? So let's turn to each of the panelists, and I'm going to start with Hillary.
Yes, so I like the river metaphor because it implies that we need to have a little bit of knowledge about where we've been and how we've gotten to this point. Hopefully moving farther down the river, we'll have a better idea of some of these tributaries and we can take some intentional action, some deliberate action as we move forward. It could be a wild ride, but I think it's really opening up some new opportunities for advisors to be more intentional and deliberate with our theory.
Thank you, Hillary. Oh. Sorry, were you done? There we go. Thank you, Hillary.
I was done.
Sorry,
yep.
I cut you off. Okay. Next, I'd like to turn to Sarah. Same question. Where's the theory of advising headed, or where would you like to see it head?
Well, I mean, I'm happy that it's got a seat at the table at this point, that people are thinking about it and recognizing that we use it, whether we think about it or not. And I'm hopeful that it makes us self-reflective and deliberate. I guess I feel like I'm saying some of what Hillary just said, but self-reflective about what we do and the way we do it and the process involved. And so that's what I'm excited about.
Cool. Janet, how would you answer the same question? Where is it headed, or where would you like to see it head?
I agree with everything that has just been said by Hillary and Sarah. And one of the things that I think is exciting is that we have the potential to develop new theory that explains something about student behavior, decision making, or their navigation of a university and their meaning making. Academic advising has the potential to develop theory specific for advising. And as such, that helps to also convey the distinctiveness of this endeavor within higher education.
Thank you, Janet. And finally, Mark.
Yep, thank you.
Same
picking
question.
up on what Janet said, picking up on what Janet said, I think that when we articulate what's distinctive about advising and make that a really inspiring and exciting statement, as I hope we can and will, that it can serve as a rallying cry to earn our profession a place at the table when issues about education are being discussed at our own institutions and nationally as well. It's a place that I don't think we have very many institutions right now, and certainly not nationally. And that's one of the things I would really like to see.
Okay. Panel, we've just got a few minutes left. I'm going to ask you to do something unusual here. Throw you a curveball. First of all, you have to keep it short. And what I'd like you to do is to imagine that you are in the room. We're all in this huge international room right now. Imagine that you are speaking to a first-year academic advisor, someone just out of graduate school, serving in their first year of academic advising. What one book would you wish to recommend that that person read, that book being the one book that has taught you the most about advising theory? Thank you. Same order. Hillary, you're first.
So that's a tall order, Peter. I've learned a lot from a lot of things. I would say John Dewey has informed my practice, so anything by him would be a great read for a first-year advisor.
What one book? What one book by Dewey?
Experience in Education.
Okay. Sarah, same question.
One book. There is a book called, I'm forgetting the first names, but the author's last names are Nakala and Ravish. It's called Matters of Interpretation. They use hermeneutic theory to help troubled inner city youth, and it really inspired me to think about using hermeneutics in a very practical way.
Janet, same question. One book.
All right. So, no, the most influential things I've read have actually been written by Mark Lowenstein. So, I'm not trying to kiss up there, Mark, but I think the one must read is the Mark. I know, Academic Advising at the University of Utopia. I'd highly recommend that.
Very good. And finally, Mark, that check is in the mail to Janet, I hope. And what one book would you recommend to our first-year advisor out there?
Wow. Well, first of all, Janet, that is mind-blowing, and thank you. You threw me off my game there. Actually, this relates to what Janet said. The one book I think very few people in education read anymore, and I think people should, is a book by Robert Hutchins, who was, during the mid-20th century, the president of the University of Chicago, called The University of Utopia. And that book was an inspiration to me at a number of points in my career, even before I was involved in advising. It's a description of an imaginary university, and it helps you to think about how envisioning an ideal future is a way of articulating your own philosophy, because that's what Hutchins did. He used this imaginary university to help him articulate a philosophy of higher education, and I think you can do the same thing for a philosophy of advising or a theory of advising. University of Utopia by Robert Hutchins.
In the remaining seconds, I will give you the book.
Probably not in print.
Okay. But the one that I would recommend is in print, and it's probably on the shelf behind you, Mark. It would be The Phaedrus by Plato, because it's the example of the first academic advising interaction and one of the best. The Phaedrus by Plato. I think we are done here. There's a couple of questions that we will answer via text. Thank you for those questions. And so we now draw to a close. Thank you all for being here. Have a good afternoon.